welcome to my channel, a place where every mystery hides a story, and every story hides a truth. In the midst of forgotten streets, footsteps echo through the silence, and the faint glow of a lamp guards secrets that refuse to die. Every clue matters. A torn letter, a fading footprint, even the sound of a clock ticking in the dark. Here, doubt becomes a puzzle, and puzzles lead us to the heart of the unknown. So prepare your mind, watch closely, and listen carefully, because the shadows are speaking, and the truth is waiting to be found. This is where every case begins. Welcome to my channel. Asterisk.
Chapter 1. The impossible crime. It was in the grey, rain-hung twilight of an unusually dreary November morning that I received word of the incident at St. Thaddeus Chapel, a small, ivy-choked church tucked away in the shadow of Hampstead Heath. Holmes and I had scarcely returned from a brief holiday in the countryside, and I was just settling into the warmth of my Baker Street study chair, a steaming cup of tea balanced upon my knee, when Mrs. Hudson announced the arrival of Inspector Lestrade. Holmes, lounging upon the sofa in a faded velvet dressing-gown, made no motion to rise, but his eyes flicked open with that sudden alertness I had come to recognize as the herald of something unusual. "Lestrade," Holmes murmured, without looking up. "From the tone of your footfall, I gather this is no routine courtesy call." Lestrade gave a small start. "You'd be right, Mr. Holmes. This one, well, even the yard is at a loss, and that doesn't happen often, as you know." "Indeed," Holmes said, rising now and taking a seat at the breakfast table where the untouched Kippers sat cooling. "Tell us." Lestrade hesitated, running a hand through his damp hair. "It happened just after dawn. Reverend Wilfred Danvers was discovered dead in the chapel vestry, locked from the inside." "Locked from the inside," I echoed. "You're certain?" "Bolt drawn, windows barred, no sign of tampering. The curate, a young fellow named Isaac Moore, found the body when he arrived to prepare the morning service. The door had to be broken down." Holmes' fingers steepled before him. "Go on." "Danvers was kneeling at the prayer rail, shot once in the heart. No weapon was found in the room, no footprints, no witnesses, and no obvious motive. And the strangest part," Lestrade paused, "the bell was ringing." "Ringing," Holmes repeated. "St. Thaddeus bell tower. It began just after 5, before anyone else arrived. The sexton, who lives nearby, says it tolled 13 times and then stopped." "13?" I asked, incredulous. "That must be superstition, or deliberate symbolism," Holmes murmured. "Continue." "There's more. The chapel well, it has a reputation." "Ah," Holmes said, lips curling. "The plot thickens. Go on, Lestrade. Let us be haunted." Lestrade frowned, clearly displeased by Holmes' levity. "Local legend. They call it the chapel that refused to die. Burned down twice, rebuilt both times. The original crypt collapsed in the 1700s, killing a dozen parishioners during Easter Mass. Folks say it's cursed." Holmes dismissed the folklore with a wave of his hand. "Let us set aside ghosts for now. What of the curate Moore you said? Seems honest enough. Only joined 6 months ago. No signs of struggle, no indication of robbery. Parish accounts balanced, no enemies that anyone knows of. Danvers was well liked. Though, ... double quotes." Lestrade trailed off, glancing at me. "The what?" Holmes prompted, eyes gleaming. "There were whispers. A woman. She attended services regularly, but kept her distance from the congregation. No one knows her name, but she often stayed after sermons. People thought Danvers was counseling her in private." "Did he mention her in any correspondence?" "Not a word. And that's another thing his journals are missing." "Everyone curious," Holmes mused. "Tell me, Lestrade, was the vestry in disarray?" "No. Apart from the missing journals, nothing seemed disturbed." Holmes stood now, stretching like a cat. "Well, Watson, it appears our holiday has come to an end." I had already risen, sensing that Holmes was slipping into his investigative trance. The air around him always seemed to sharpen when a mystery worthy of his intellect presented itself. "I presume we're to Hampstead?" I asked, reaching for my coat. Holmes nodded, already drawing his fingers along the line of his jaw. "Indeed. A man kneeling in prayer, shot in a locked room. A bell ringing 13 times without a ringer, and journals vanished into thin air. My dear Watson, how could we resist such a case?" We arrived at St. Thaddeus just past 10 o'clock. A drizzle fell steadily from the leaden sky, and the towering silhouette of the chapel loomed against the trees like something from a medieval woodcut. Its stone face was mottled with age, and black ivy clung to the steeple like the grip of a withered hand. Inside, The scent of incense still lingered in the nave. The space was hushed, as though in reverence or fear. Reverend Danvers had already been removed, but Lestrade led us to the vestry, a small wood-paneled room tucked behind the altar. Holmes crouched over the doorway, examining the lock and bolt. Forced inward, he observed. Roughly. 2. You see here splinters from the jamb, consistent with a shoulder ram. He entered the room, eyes scanning this. A tidy desk, a shelf of him, a modest wardrobe, and a dusty armchair. Nothing overturned. No signs of struggle. The wound was to the chest, you say. Straight through the heart, Lestrade confirmed. Holmes moved toward the prayer rail, where Danvers had been found. Still knelt, even in death, he murmured. Odd, don't you think? A man shot from close range should collapse, but this suggests he remained upright for some time. I frowned. Could it have been suicide? Then, no weapon was found, Watson, and the angle would have been most unnatural. Besides, there is no blood spatter on the walls, meaning the shot was clean, controlled, a professional touch. Holmes suddenly stepped back and tilted his head, staring at the modest brass bell rope that dangled from the corner of the room. No bell rope here, he said. The main tower rope must be in the narthex. It is, Lestrade confirmed, and yet it rang. Holmes turned slowly to face us, his expression unreadable. A chapel steeped in superstition. A reverend found dead in prayer. Journals vanished. A woman no one knows. And a bell that rings itself. He smiled faintly. Watson, we are not chasing ghosts. We are chasing a mind. Chapter 2. The Echoes in the Nave. The following morning found us back in our familiar quarters at 221B Baker Street, the lamplight glowing dimly in defiance of the grey light outside. Holmes sat cross-legged in his armchair by the hearth, fingertips pressed together beneath his chin. His gaze turned inward, as if communing with invisible diagrams traced upon the ceiling. Meanwhile, was at my desk with a notebook open, trying to make sense of the jumble of impressions the visit to St. Thaddeus had left in my mind, though I had stood beside Holmes at the vestry's threshold, taking in the same broken lock, the same prayer rail, and the same polished crucifix above the mantel. I felt as though I'd glimpsed only the surface of some deeper mechanism. Holmes, I knew, was already plumbing its hidden workings. What do you make of it, Watson? He asked without turning his head. I looked up from my scroll. It's a most perplexing business. A man was murdered in a locked room without a sign of forced entry, and the only disturbance was the missing journals. It smacks of deliberate planning. Indeed, yet the precision of it all is unsettling. You recall, no doubt, the story of Father Dominique in Avignon. I blinked. The cleric who was strangled inside his confessional oven. Though the doors were barred from within, Holmes nodded. Yes, that case, too, had the markings of the impossible, and yet it was no ghost, but an ingenious mechanism hidden beneath the confessional floor. You believe there may be something of the same nature here? Holmes smiled faintly. Not necessarily mechanical, Watson, but certainly unnatural in the sense of human cunning. I noted 3 particulars yesterday that warrant further reflection. He rose, moving to the breakfast table, where a single envelope sat unopened. First, the absence of blood spatter. A clean wound to the chest would bleed profusely, yet the rug beneath Danvers was scarcely marked. Second, the bell. It rang 13 times before stopping, and no one saw it pulled. And third, those missing journals. Every entry of his writing vanished, while hymnals and ledgers remained untouched. He opened the envelope with the edge of his butter knife and scanned its contents. I watched his brow lift. From Lestrade, he murmured, he's had the chapel searched again. No sign of the journals. But listen to this. The bell's interior mechanism shows signs of tampering. Grease on the rope guide, and a faint trace of soot near the clapper, as if something was ... ignited. Set to ring by fire, I said, incredulous. Holmes gave a thoughtful hum. Or, perhaps, by heat. There are numerous ways to trigger movement. Chemical, mechanical, and thermal. I suspect the ringing was not only intentional, but timed. To draw attention, I asked. He shook his head. Or, to misdirect. A theatrical flourish intended to unsettle rather than inform. Such flourishes are often used to manipulate witnesses into interpreting events through the lens of superstition. It is easier to frighten a congregation than to fool a single mind. He moved to the mantel and lit a fresh pipe. The smoke curled upward like thought itself. Tell me, Watson, what do you make of this mysterious woman? The one seen speaking to Danvers. I assumed she was a parishioner seeking spiritual counsel. Holmes chuckled. So might anyone, but a woman who vanishes without a name. who attends regularly and stays behind without joining the congregation, who is whispered about and remembered solely by presence rather than words. Does she not strike you as curiously constructed? I frowned. You think she was deliberately inserting herself into the Reverend's routine? Holmes tapped his pipe against the hearth. I think it is more likely that she was not there for him at all. There was a knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson entered with a small tray tea for myself and a single scone, which Holmes promptly ignored. Alongside the teapot lay a folded broadsheet. I unfolded it idly and caught sight of a short column near the bottom corner. Murder in Hampstead Chapel baffles police. I read aloud. Local constabulary remain mystified by the death of Reverend Danvers, whose body was discovered yesterday morning within the locked vestry of St. Thaddeus Church. No suspects have been named. Inspector Lestrade has declined to comment. Ah, the press, Holmes said with a note of disdain, always eager to print what little they know, and much that they do not. He turned toward the window, gazing at the sodden rooftops outside. We shall return to the chapel this afternoon, Watson. I wish to speak to the sexton directly. His account of the bell ringing deserves scrutiny. You suspect he's hiding something? No. But people misremember the very things they see most vividly. Our minds, Watson, fill in what we do not comprehend with what we expect. He heard 13 rings. Yes, but was it truly the bell, or something that resembled its tone? Was it truly 13, or merely more than 12? Holmes paused and gave a tight smile. Moreover, who benefits from Danvers' death? We are so caught up in the method that we've not yet asked the question of motive. I scribbled this down, still feeling half lost in a fog of conjecture. And what of the curse the villagers speak of? He waved a hand. Stories to comfort frightened minds. But stories often carry kernels of truth. We must tread that line carefully, discerning which fears are born of imagination, and which are planted by design. Outside, the rain began to slow, and Holmes turned from the window, with decision in his step. Come, Watson. A chapel that refuses to die may yet speak if only we know how to. Listen. Chapter 3. The Hollow Silence of St. Thaddeus. We returned to St. Thaddeus that afternoon under a sullen sky. The stone chapel hunched like a forgotten relic at the edge of the heath. The rain had ceased, but the air still held a damp chill that clung to our collars and seeped into the bones. Holmes strode ahead of me, his overcoat flaring slightly with each purposeful step. He had been uncharacteristically quiet during our cab ride, eyes half closed, fingers drumming on his knee in rhythmic concentration. I knew that silence, well, it meant the machinery of his mind was in full motion, devouring fragments and impressions, waiting only for the right moment to strike. As we approached the chapel gates, a figure emerged from the shadows. Near the bell tower, a stooped man, with a lined face and thinning hair. He clutched a worn cap in one hand, and seemed to brace himself as we neared. "Mr. Holmes, sir?" the man asked, eyes flicking from Holmes to me. "Yes," Holmes replied. "You must be Mr. Elric the sexton." The man nodded slowly. Isaac Moore told me you'd be coming. I'll do my best to help, though I'll admit, I've not slept much since." He trailed off, and Holmes gave a gentle incline of his head. "We'll speak plainly. Mr. Elric, tell me about the morning you found the Reverend." Elric's voice lowered, as if the stones themselves might be listening. "I live in the cottage just beyond the chapel wall. Always have. That morning was just past 5 when I heard it. The bell. Loud and wrong, sir. Not like a call to prayer, but angry, if that makes sense. And it tolled 13 times. You're certain of the number?" "I counted, sir. I was standing by my window, hand on the latch. I was that frightened I nearly bolted it shut." "You saw no one enter or leave the chapel?" "No, sir. But the mist was thick, could barely see the tower spire." Holmes nodded, making a mental note. "And the bell rope, who has access to it?" "Only me, Reverend Danvers, and young Isaac. But the bell's heavy, and it takes some strength to ring properly. Even the curate struggles with it." Holmes turned his gaze upward to the tower. "Has it ever rung by accident? In wind, perhaps?" Elric shook his head. "Never. And that morning, no wind at all." Holmes thanked him and moved toward the chapel doors, which creaked open beneath his hand. We stepped into the nave, where light filtered through stained glass, in weary patches of red and gold. The silence within was absolute, save for the occasional creak of ancient wood, or the whisper of our steps on stone. Holmes made directly for the vestry once more, but this time, his eyes swept across the chapel floor before he passed the altar. He paused suddenly and knelt. "Watson here." I joined him and saw what he had found, a faint smudge on the flagstone, no larger than a coin. It was dark, almost sooty, but lacked the grainy texture of ash. Holmes dabbed it with his handkerchief, then sniffed. Lamp oil, he murmured, mixed with some form of resin, possibly pine. I blinked. From the bell tower, Holmes didn't answer directly. Instead, he stood and continued his inspection. As we reached the vestry door, still splintered at the frame, he turned his attention to the floorboards beneath the threshold. He knelt again, running a long, thin finger along the groove between planks. No dust, he muttered. Wiped clean. Inside the vestry, the room appeared unchanged from our last visit, but Holmes moved with deliberation, ignoring the prayer rail entirely. He examined the back wall, then stepped toward the modest bookshelf behind the desk. "You see, Watson," he said, "one often finds deception not in what is present, but in what is missing. Look at this shelf. Hymnals arranged perfectly yet not a single mark of dust beneath them. They were removed recently." I asked. "Not only removed, but also replaced with care, as if to give the impression of nothing touched. Asterisk." He turned now to the wardrobe in the corner, and opened it slowly. Inside hung the Reverend's cassock, a heavy woolen garment, and a few neatly pressed shirts. Holmes examined each one, checking seams, cuffs, and collars. He paused at a gray overcoat, lifting its lapel with care. There, barely visible, was a tiny thread of red silk caught in the stitching. Holmes plucked it out with tweezers and held it to the light. "Watson, what do you make of this?" I examined it. "Silk. Not from any garment I've seen here." "Precisely. It speaks of someone else, someone who brushed too close. Unaware they left a signature." He replaced the coat and shut the wardrobe. Finally, Holmes returned to the prayer rail, the spot where Danvers had died. He knelt beside it, studying the floor. "Here," he said. "See this notch? The rug is slightly raised, as though something lay beneath it recently." We peeled it back carefully. Beneath the rug was a narrow wooden plank, its edges worn smooth. Holmes tapped it gently, then lifted it. A shallow cavity lay beneath, empty. "A hiding place," I said. "Indeed. For what, we cannot yet say, but the placement is deliberate." Danvers knelt in prayer above it, and someone knew he would. Holmes lowered the plank and stood, dusting off his hands. A vestry scrubbed of clues. A bell tolled by unseen hands. A dead man above a hidden compartment. "My dear Watson, we are not merely following a murderer. We are following a mind that wishes to erase its presence." Chapter 4. The Shadows of the Flock. It was just past 4 o'clock when Holmes and I convened with the remaining members of the St. Thaddeus Circle. They had gathered reluctantly, summoned at Holmes' request, and under the quiet pressure of Lestrade's growing unease. The small office attached to the rectory served as our meeting place, a plain room of stone and wood, still redolent with candle wax and cold stone. Holmes stood at the head of the chamber, fingers laced behind his back, eyes half-lidded but watchful. He said little as the individuals entered one by one, preferring to observe them as they took their seats. I recognized the flicker of assessment in his gaze, the noting of every twitch, every awkward pause, each involuntary glance. The first to arrive was Isaac Moore, the young curate. Barely into his 30s, Moore was pale, slight, and bookish in appearance, with round glasses that slid down his nose as he spoke. He had served under Reverend Danvers for 6 months, and seemed genuinely shaken by the events. "I cannot make sense of it," he said quietly, glancing at Holmes. Reverend Danvers was a kind man. He had a gravity about him, but never he was the sort that listened more than he spoke. "It's unbearable to think of him like that." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "And yet someone bore him ill enough will to kill him silently, methodically, and in the house of God." Moore flinched at the word kill. He offered nothing further. Next came Eleanor Dattery, a sharp-faced woman in her mid-50s, who identified herself as the chapel treasurer and longtime member of the vestry committee. She carried herself like a schoolmistress if, in bearing, with eyes that darted and lips that pursed each time someone spoke too freely. "Frankly, I never liked the man," she announced with no hint of guilt. "He brought in strange ideas, even for a modern clergyman. All this business with personal meditation and closed-door sermons. The church has always stood for community, not for secrecy." "And what do you mean by closed-door sermons?" Holmes asked. "Oh, they weren't official," she replied, sniffing. "But there was one woman in particular. Came nearly every week, sat in the back pew. Sometimes she arrived early, sometimes late, but she always lingered after. I never caught her name, he never introduced us." Holmes raised a brow. "Can you describe her?" "Medium height. Always wore a scarf around her hair, and long gloves. Brown or gray clothing, nothing remarkable. Except she refused to speak to anyone, almost like she was trying not to be remembered, or trying to disappear." I murmured. Eleanor sniffed again, folding her hands. I told Danvers that his indulgences would attract attention. The third person to arrive was Timothy Cranton, the chapel's organist, a tall, reed-thin man, with yellowed fingers and a perpetually nervous expression. He looked as though he had been pulled from the instrument he loved and thrust into daylight against his will. He wrung his hands continually as he spoke, and his voice trembled. I didn't know him well. The Reverend, he wasn't fond of music. Said he found it ... distracting. Holmes looked up at that. Curious. Most clergy use music to elevate the soul. Yes, well, Crowthorne mumbled. He said it interrupted thought. Holmes studied him for a moment. Where were you the morning of the murder? At home. I only come in on Sundays. I don't even have a key to the chapel. Have you ever seen this mysterious woman Miss Datchery described? Crowthorne hesitated, then nodded. Once or twice. She used the side door near the vestry steps. I thought she might be, well, troubled. You know the sort. Holmes did not respond. His gaze had shifted to the final arrival, Miss Maud Larch, a volunteer who tended to the chapel's flowers and, according to Lestrade, occasionally cleaned the altar. She was a quiet woman of indeterminate age, her features pale, and her hair pinned severely back. She sat nearest the door, and kept her eyes on the floor. You knew Reverend Danvers well? Holmes asked her. She hesitated, then nodded. He was patient. Listen to me. Didn't mind if I stayed late. And did you? Sometimes, after services. Did you ever see him with the woman others have mentioned? A longer pause. Then, yes. Holmes moved slightly closer. Do you know who she is? Maud shook her head. No name. But once I saw her crying. In the chapel, she was kneeling at the altar rail. And her gloves were stained like she'd been holding something that bled ink. Holmes leaned back. Did Reverend Danvers speak to her? Maud nodded. He did, but only quietly. I couldn't hear. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, he slowly walked to the window and looked out across the heath. The last light of day was draining from the sky, and shadows crept across the stones outside. When he turned back, his face was unreadable. Thank you all. Your candor is appreciated. Lestrade, standing behind Holmes, gave a quiet nod. That'll be all for now. You'll be contacted if we need more. One by one, the group filed out. Holmes watched them closely, saying nothing until the last footsteps had faded down the corridor. Well, Watson, he said, drawing the curtains closed. We now have a grieving curate, a scornful treasurer, a twitchy organist, and a silent cleaner, all of whom saw the same ghost, and none of whom knew how to look at her. And what do you make of them? I asked. Holmes turned back, toward me, his eyes distant but gleaming. They are suspects, Watson, not because they lied but because they each told us a truth shaped carefully around a missing center. A woman, yes, a death, certainly, but behind it all, a secret, buried in silence. Chapter 5. A motive to convene the following morning broke, damp and listless, with the sullen drizzle of the night clinging to rooftops and puddling on Baker Street's cobbled path. Holmes stood at the window, gazing absently through the thin veil of mist that softened the city's outline. His pipe remained unlit in his hand. Forgotten, an omission I knew to be significant. He was troubled, not by what we had uncovered the day prior, but by how easily it had been presented. Watson, he said at last, still facing the glass, do you ever find yourself suspicious of an answer that arrives too early? I set aside the morning paper. Frequently, especially when it comes with all the neatness of a confession, but none of the conviction. He turned then, nodding slightly. Just so. The tale of the mysterious woman, our so-called spectral presences, already beginning to harden into narrative. Each witness mentions her. Each offers a fragment that seems to corroborate the others. And yet, ... he trailed off, lost in thought. And yet, I continued for him. Not one of them knew her name. Not one saw her closely. Not one knew where she came from, or where she went. It's as though she appeared solely for their telling. Holmes gave a dry smile. You've begun to think like a detective, Watson. An excellent sign. Just then, a sharp knock interrupted us. Lestrade entered, his expression tightly wound with restrained satisfaction. Look, I had seen too many times to trust outright. We've got him. Holmes, he said without preamble. Holmes arched an eyebrow. Indeed, Timothy the organist. Holmes gestured for him to proceed. We checked his rooms last night. Found a pair of gloves, stained with lamp oil, same residue you found on the bell mechanism. And under his floorboards, a pocket journal. Belonged to Danvers. His name's written inside the cover. I leaned forward. One of the missing volumes. Exactly, Lestrade confirmed. Why would an innocent man hide a dead vicar's diary in his home? Holmes neither moved nor replied. His eyes grew distant. then sharp again in an instant. And the gloves, matching fibers to the rope. He had access to the tower. Said he practiced there sometimes to warm up before services. A solitary man. Already nervous by nature, Holmes murmured, who now finds himself the perfect suspect. Lestrade misunderstood the tone and pressed on eagerly. Look, I'm not saying it's open and shut, but we've enough to detain him. There's motive, too. Motive? Holmes asked, his voice carefully neutral. Lestrade opened his notebook. Danvers wanted him dismissed, said he was unreliable, came late, made mistakes, resisted changes to the music program. It's all in one of the vestry meeting notes. Datchery confirmed it. Holmes tilted his head slightly. So, we are to believe that Mr. Crowthorne, feeble of build and mild of voice, somehow overpowered the Reverend, murdered him in a locked room, staged the ringing of the bell using grease and heat, and then smuggled away his journals to hide under his floorboards, all while anticipating no one would ever trace the rope fibers back to him. Lestrade faltered. When you put it like that, precisely, Holmes said crisply. You have a man who fits the outline of guilt too conveniently. The oil, the journal, the timing, all signs are pointing in a single direction, but all of them are discoverable with almost no effort. It is not a puzzle, Lestrade. It is a performance. He stood, moving to his bookshelf, from which he drew a thin volume and flipped it open. Do you know what I dislike most in these affairs, Watson? He said, not looking up. When someone underestimates my interest in detail. The book that was hidden, what page was it open to? Lestrade blinked. Page, 23, I think. Ah, the Sermon on the Lamb of Sacrifice. Not especially controversial. He snapped the book shut. Crowthorne is being framed sloppily. Lestrade frowned. But by whom? You think one of the others planted the journal? Holmes nodded, and did so before we even entered the chapel the first time. Recall the shelf dust wiped clean, but too perfectly. Something was removed, replaced or hidden, and someone knew that eventually we would come sniffing. So they left a trail. Then who? I asked. Let us consider each, Holmes said, pacing now. Moore is too emotional to construct such a careful deception, though not beyond suspicion. Datchery is precise, calculating and deeply resentful of Danvers' ministry. Miss Larch is quiet, observant, and admitted she stayed late after services. All had opportunity, but one in particular had motive and access and a knowledge of the chapel's routines, more intimate than she revealed. Datchery, I said. Perhaps, or perhaps someone we have not yet truly seen. He stopped. Tell me, Watson, did you notice the side door in the chapel? The one Crowthorne mentioned? Yes. Leads from the side nave to the vestry stairs. Unlocked during services, seldom monitored. The perfect entrance for someone who wished to move unseen. You think the mysterious woman used it? Undoubtedly. And I think she did not vanish after the murder, only changed her manner of appearance. A silence hung in the room. Then Holmes said softly, we must return to St. Thaddeus, and not through the front. Lestrade sighed. I'll arrange the release of Crowthorne for now. But Holmes, if you're wrong, I rarely am, Holmes said with a faint smile. But if I am, the truth will trap me, along with the guilty. Let us hope the next thread does not break under our fingers. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. We returned to St. Thaddeus under the cover of a rain-laced dusk. The stone chapel squatting like a slumbering gargoyle against the mauve horizon. Its Gothic arches stretched upward into the mist as if in silent lament, and the bell tower loomed with funereal solemnity. Holmes insisted we avoid the main entrance. Divisible, he murmured, leading us through a crumbling garden path at the rear, beneath overgrown yew trees. The Theatre of Faith hides many backstage entrances. Lestrade, now mildly skeptical, after releasing Crowthorne, under Holmes's counsel, followed close behind. And you think our killer used this same route? I think, Holmes replied. They're still using it. He came to a halt near the east wall of the chapel. Hidden between ivy-covered stones was a narrow wooden door, aged but sturdy, its iron latch rusted only in appearance. Holmes withdrew a small key from his pocket, borrowed from the sacristy register. He said by way of explanation. The lock yielded with a reluctant click. Inside, the corridor was narrow and lined with faded hymnals, the scent of mildew and extinguished incense wafting from every brick. Holmes motioned for silence, and we advanced toward the vestry stairs with hushed steps. Just before the stairwell, Holmes paused. There, he whispered, pointing to a thin film of sawdust scattered near the baseboard. He knelt, fresh and unnatural. No carpenter's been here. Lestrade peered down. So what does it mean? Holmes brushed a finger through it, then sniffed. It's not sawdust. Powdered chalk and ash. Used in tracing hidden markings or to reveal recent contact. He stood and moved to the wall. "Watson, lend me your cane." I passed it over. Holmes tapped gently along the stone panels, and on the fourth strode hollow. With calculated pressure, he pressed against the panel, which gave with a soft click, revealing a narrow cavity carved into the stonework dot inside. Barely visible, lay a scrap of parchment. Holmes extracted it with delicate fingers. By the weak light of Lestrade's lantern, we saw what it bore, a sketch crudely drawn of the chapel's interior, with a single star inked beneath the pulpit. Lestrade squinted. "A map. A message," Holmes corrected. "Or rather, a reminder. The pulpit is the key. That's where we'll find the next piece." He replaced the panel and led us quickly through the passage. Within minutes, we emerged behind the altar, concealed from view. The chapel was dim and deserted, save for the quiet whisper of wind through cracked panes and the creak of ancient timber. The pews stretched out like soldiers awaiting orders. Holmes strode to the pulpit, running a hand along the carved railing. "Note the ornamentation here," he said. "Common motifs. The lamb, the shepherd, the gate." But here he tapped a small etching near the base, a vine curling counterclockwise. Unlike the rest, he pressed the carving inward. With a faint snick, a segment of the pulpit floor popped up by a fraction of an inch. Holmes pried it open, revealing a shallow compartment beneath. Within it lay a folded note, a key, and a delicate gold ring. The note read, "He preached of light, but turned from it." He sought to silence the voice he could not understand. But words, once spoken, do not die. They echo in stone. Watson felt the chill first, a subtle, creeping weight in the air that seemed to still even the breath in our lungs. Lestrade spoke low. "What is this? Some kind of confession?" Holmes examined the ring. It was engraved on the inside. "To ML in forgiveness. Always, T.D. Martin Larch and Thaddeus Danvers," I said slowly. Holmes nodded. "It appears the Reverend once gave this to Miss Larch. The initials match. But the sentiment does not speak of romance, it speaks of atonement. So he wronged her." Lestrade murmured. Holmes studied the note again. Or he silenced her voice perhaps. Literally. He turned the key over in his hand. Small, ornate, meant for a private drawer or cabinet, not a door. "Perhaps one of the vestry chests," I offered. Holmes nodded. "That is our next stop." We made our way quietly into the vestry. The room, though modest, bore all the dignity of its sacred function. Clerical robes hung neatly. Ledgers and sermons lined the shelves. At the back stood a narrow desk with several small drawers. Holmes tested each in turn, and on the third attempt, the key clicked home. He opened it slowly. Inside were 2 letters and posted and a torn photograph. The letters were addressed in Danvers's hand. "To Miss L. I have considered your request again, and I must implore you leave the past buried. The parish cannot survive a scandal. What was done in weakness, not malice. Let us both seek peace in silence." The second letter, clearly never sent, was to the bishop. "Your Grace, I fear I have sinned, not only in act, but in cowardice. Miss Larch was right to press me. Truth should not remain buried for the sake of appearances. I shall speak this Sunday, and lay it bare before the congregation. Should I not survive it, no, I go to my judgment willing." The signature was dated the day before his death. "Good God," I whispered. "He was going to confess to something significant," Holmes said gravely, "and someone made sure he never did." Lestrade looked up. "So what now? Do we bring in Miss Larch?" Holmes shook his head. "Not yet. She may be complicit or merely another victim. But there is one figure whose absence continues to puzzle me." Holmes's face darkened. "He claims to have been here the night of the death, claims to have been in the chapel, working late, and yet he mentioned no sound, no sign of struggle. How curious." He looked toward the darkened hallway. "We shall speak to him next, but not as visitors." He turned to us both. "Tonight, we return not as detectives but as shadows." Chapter 7. A voice beneath the choir. A sallow moon hung over the chapel's spire, as Holmes, Lestrade and I returned, under cover of a deeper night. We were cloaked, quite literally, in borrowed cassocks. Holmes's idea, of course, to blend into the shadows of faith and dust. Inside, St. Thaddeus was silent but not still. The chapel exhaled, creaked, shifted like a sleeping body. Holmes had chosen the choir loft as our vantage point. It overlooked the nave, the pulpit, and most importantly the vestry hallway. A narrow trapdoor above gave access to the bell tower, should an emergency escape be required. Holmes crouched, glass to his eye, studying the corridor below. "We must assume," he whispered, "that someone returns here nightly, not to mourn, but to manipulate. to destroy or to recover what they failed to erase. I nodded. You believe they suspect something is hidden still? Or worse, Holmes murmured, that something has returned to haunt them. Lestrade, wedged between pew and beam, scoffed softly. Surely you're not suggesting that ghost stories hold merit? Holmes offered the faintest smile. Ghosts rarely commit murder, Inspector, but belief in them can serve as excellent camouflage. Midnight arrived in silence. For nearly an hour, the chapel held its breath. A rat scuttled through the rafters. The wood groaned in the cold. A lantern outside gutted against the wind. Still, nothing stirred. Then footsteps. Soft, deliberate, nearing the vestry. Holmes's hand closed around my forearm. Steady but urgent. Below, a figure emerged from the hallway shadows, holding a small lantern low to the ground. The yellow light danced along the chapel's stone, catching a glint of wire-framed glasses. Datchery, I whispered. The sacristan moved with practiced caution, not the tentative tread of a man fearing discovery, but the ritual steps of someone who had walked this corridor many times, under many secrets. He made for the pulpit. Holmes leaned in, observed carefully. Datchery knelt before the altar, reached into his coat, and retrieved something small, perhaps a folded paper or cloth-wrapped parcel. He slid it beneath the second floorboard step. Then he stood and muttered something under his breath. A prayer, a plea. Then he turned and began his retreat. Holmes acted with silent precision. He darted from the loft, down the stair, and into the side aisle with all the quietude of a stalking lynx. Lestrade and I followed close behind, and as Datchery reached the narthex, Holmes stepped into his path. Working late again. Mr. Datchery, the sacristan recoiled, his lantern swinging wildly. Mr. Holmes. I was merely checking on the building. It suffers leaks when it rains. Does it rain secrets too? Holmes asked, stepping aside just enough for Lestrade to bar the chapel doors. Datchery's composure frayed instantly. I don't understand. Holmes turned to me. Watson kindly retrieved the item from beneath the pulpit stair. I hurried to the place and lifted the step. Inside, wrapped in aged linen, was a stack of letters, some sealed, others torn, and a small book, bound in worn calfskin. A ledger, I realized, dated 2 years prior. Holmes opened it and skimmed. Donations, building repairs, stipends to clergy, and a discrepancy here. Nearly £500 paid to a B. Milford for architectural restoration. But there was no restoration, was there? Datchery looked cornered. It was the Reverend's arrangement. I merely followed orders. And you continued to hide his correspondence after his death. Datchery faltered, looking down at his shaking hands. He was being blackmailed. Lestrade straightened. By whom? I don't know, Datchery stammered. He never told me names, but I know he feared the letters getting out. There was someone who knew about a past transgression. He paid them off. Once, twice, then again. Toward the end, he said he wouldn't do it anymore. Said he'd reveal everything from the pulpit. Take the disgrace publicly. Holmes exchanged a glance with me, and the next day he was dead. Datchery bowed his head. I found him that night, before anyone else arrived. I didn't touch the body, I swear, but I panicked. I thought if I removed the letters, no one else would know. But someone else already did know, Holmes said quietly. Someone who made sure the Reverend never spoke. Lestrade stepped forward. You're not under arrest yet, but you'll stay where we can find you. Holmes turned the book in his hands again, studying the handwriting. This signature here be Milford. We need to find out who that is. Datchery, now seated and pale, said faintly, he never came here. Reverend Danvers met him in town, once, I think. I only ever heard the name. Holmes nodded slowly. Then our next step is not within these walls, but in the town's records. I suspect Mr. Milford is not an architect at all, but a conduit. The money trail will tell us more. He slipped the ledger into his coat and cast one last glance. Around the dark chapel, the dead may rest, he said, but the truth is still wide awake. As we stepped out into the chill of morning, the fog clung low to the ground, as though reluctant to let us leave the grave of secrets behind. But Holmes's pace was swift. The threads were drawing tighter, and the hands that wove them were beginning to tremble. Chapter 8. The Man Behind the Name. The morning sun emerged reluctantly, filtered through grim clouds like light through dusty vellum. We had returned to Baker Street only long enough to gather what Holmes deemed essential: a notepad, a city directory, and a sharp appetite for bureaucracy. B. Milford, Holmes muttered, his finger trailing down the index of names in the London Registry of Trades and Licenses. No architect listed under that name in London, nor in Berkshire, nor surrounding parishes. But, he tapped twice on the page, there is a Benjamin Milford, registered in Paddington. Not as an architect, but as a trustee of Clerical Fund Distributions. Clerical Fund Distributions, I echoed. A charity. Nominally, Holmes replied, closing the volume with a soft thud. It has the markings of a shell institution of financial sieve for money to pass through with. Minimal questions asked. Lestrade, who had rejoined us after a brief call to Scotland Yard, leaned in. Shall I request a warrant? Not yet, Holmes said, rising. Too early, and we risk frightening the bird. No, Watson and I will pay Mr. Milford a friendly visit. An hour later, we were standing outside a narrow building tucked between a cobbler's shop and a solicitor's office, its signage flaking gold lettering that read simply, Clerical Fund Distributions. Second floor. The staircase groaned beneath our feet. The door at the top bore a nameplate. B. Milford, Director. Holmes knocked once, twice, a pause, then a shuffling step within, and the door opened. Benjamin Milford was a man in his mid-40s, balding but broad-shouldered, with a kind of deliberate politeness one associates with lifelong clerks or practiced liars. Gentlemen, he inquired, squinting past wire-rimmed spectacles. Sherlock Holmes, my companion said smoothly, extending a gloved hand, and this is Dr. Watson. We're making inquiries regarding recent financial activity involving a Reverend Charles Danvers of St. Thaddeus Chapel. Milford's eyes flickered not surprise, exactly, but a guarded tension. I'm sorry, he said with a faint smile. We distribute support funds to dozens of clergymen each year. The name escapes me. Holmes gave no hint of reaction. Odd, he said gently, producing the ledger from his coat. Your name appears multiple times. Payments received in exchange for architectural services, though. I find no record of your qualifications as an architect. Milford's smile thinned. I merely relayed funds on behalf of a donor. The architectural description must have been clerical shorthand. Holmes stepped inside without invitation. May we sit, Mr. Milford? I suppose, Milford replied, already losing the upper hand. The room was small and spurred filing cabinets, a desk with ink and blotter, and a dusty window with thin curtains. Holmes moved like a hound on familiar scent, eyeing the filing cabinet. You were a conduit then? He asked a courier for another. I'm a facilitator, Milford replied, straightening. I manage donations that are sometimes sensitive. To whom did you forward the payments from Reverend Danvers? Holmes asked, soft but sharp. Milford hesitated. There was no formal record. The donor insisted on privacy. And you accepted that? I was paid too. Holmes tilted his head. So you admit being the middleman in an unofficial transaction involving a member of the clergy, conducted under false pretenses. Milford bristled. There was nothing illegal in it. That remains to be seen. Holmes's eyes flicked to the side wall, where a framed certificate caught the light oddly. He stepped over and examined it. Your license to operate here expired 8 months ago. Milford paled slightly. Holmes turned slowly. Tell me the name of the man who instructed you to use the title architect. I can't, Milford said. He told me if anyone came asking. I am not anyone, Holmes said. And if you refuse, the next to come asking will carry a warrant and a charge sheet. A long silence. Then Milford exhaled. He called himself Mr. Southcote. That's all I know. He paid in cash. Always arrived in a hired brougham. Never gave a fixed address. A quiet man, young, smooth-spoken, well-dressed. Paid me £50 for my services, and I was to keep all records verbal. Southcote, I murmured. Uncommon name. Holmes nodded. Did he mention any connection to the church? Milford blinked. He said only that Danvers owed him, that if the payments stopped, something buried would be unearthed. He mentioned a confession. I assumed that it was a private matter. Holmes finished. Milford nodded grimly. Holmes stood and straightened his cuffs. You'll write down every meeting you had with Mr. Southcote. Dates, times, locations, words spoken, everything you remember. Send the record to my residence by morning. Scotland Yard will follow up shortly. Milford swallowed. If he finds out, I dare say, Holmes said, pausing at the door. You should have thought of that before becoming an accomplice to blackmail. Back on the street, I turned to Holmes as we stepped into the waiting cab. You believe this Mr. Southcote is our man? I believe, Holmes said, tapping the ledger. He is the hand behind Danvers' silence, and possibly the one that silenced him permanently. But his identity will come, Holmes interrupted, a name that rare cannot hide forever. As the cab rattled toward the yard, Holmes stared through the fogged window, his reflection a ghost beside mine. The hunt had begun in earnest. The voice behind the blackmail now had a face blurred perhaps, but forming, and Holmes, with his hunter's instinct awakened, would not let it vanish into shadow. Chapter 9. The Whisper in the Crypt. The late afternoon sun cast fractured, golden slats across the paving stones. As Holmes and I arrived once more at St. Thaddeus, it had rained briefly, just enough to darken the earth and leave the grave markers slick with a pearly sheen. Reverend Pitt met us beneath the stone archway of the chapel entrance, his expression one of wary curiosity. "You've returned," he said, stepping aside to let us pass. "I take it you've discovered something of interest." "Several things," Holmes replied, "though I suspect the most illuminating discoveries may yet lie beneath our feet." Pitt raised an eyebrow. "You mean the crypt?" Holmes nodded. "You mentioned before that it was sealed after the fire, but I believe the Reverend Danvers may have accessed it again in recent weeks, possibly in secret." Pitt looked startled. "But that's impossible. The entrance is barred with iron, and I have the only key." "And yet something drew him down there," Holmes said. "Whether records, relics, or memory, it was worth his time and, perhaps, his life." The vicar hesitated. "I'll unlock it, but I must warn you, it's in a dreadful state. Damp, mildew. Much of it was never properly restored after the fire 10 years ago. I expect nothing less." Holmes murmured. We followed Pitt through the rear vestry and into a narrow stone corridor that spiraled downward beneath the eastern transept. The air grew steadily cooler and wetter, thick with the scent of moss and charred stone. The vicar paused before a rusted iron gate, produced a heavy key from a ring at his belt, and turned it with some difficulty. With a protesting groan, the gate swung inward. Holmes lit a lantern, and its yellow glow pushed back the gloom. We descended slowly, the stairs crumbling at the edges, until the passage leveled into a broad chamber lined with shallow alcoves. Old tombs slept in silence along the walls, their plaques nearly erased by time. In the center of the room lay the remnants of what might once have been a wooden lectern, now reduced to a soggy pile of ash and broken timbers. Holmes knelt beside it. "Burned. Recently, too." He touched a finger to the ash, rubbed it, and brought it to his nose. "Not 10 years old. Not even 10 days. What would someone burn in a crypt?" I asked. "Something they did not wish the living to read," Holmes replied. "Perhaps a confession." Pitt's brow furrowed. "You think Danvers came here to destroy something, or retrieve it?" Holmes said. He moved past the wreckage and examined the walls with unusual focus. Then he stopped before a small recess, half hidden by collapsed stone. "Watson, light here, if you would." I raised my lantern. There, tucked into the gap, was a small bundle wrapped in oilskin, soot-stained but intact. Holmes extracted it carefully and unwrapped the cloth to reveal a set of papers. Their edges singed but mostly legible. "A miracle," Holmes murmured. Pitt peered over his shoulder. "What is it?" "A ledger," Holmes said, flipping through. "A record of donations, payments, and ... Ah, he pointed to a line. £100, paid by CFD to B. Milford. Noted as repairs and chapel restoration. See architectural invoice. And here," he continued, a note beneath, in a different hand. "Per instruction of ES, documents to be concealed beneath the crypt lectern." "ES," he looked up sharply. "Not Southcote, Watson. Edward That, at last, is our blackmailer." Pitt swallowed. "Do you mean to say this man, Southcote, paid for illegal works? That he used the chapel for some private scheme?" "Worse," Holmes said, rising. "He used Reverend Danvers. Used his guilt, perhaps, or his past mistakes, as leverage." "But for what purpose?" I asked. "This does not look like extortion for money. These sums are small, far too small for profit." "I agree," Holmes said. "Which makes me wonder, was Southcote buying silence? Or buying complicity?" He turned to Pitt. "Reverend, was Danvers acting differently these past few weeks? Nervous, preoccupied, distracted?" "Yes," Pitt replied after a moment. "He spent long hours in his office. Refused to accept guests after service. I assumed it was stress. Perhaps his health. Did he ever mention the name "Never, though once he did speak of someone from his past. A yoke he couldn't shake. I thought he meant spiritual burden." Holmes looked thoughtful. What if the burden was literal? He turned again to the ledger, scanning until he found a final entry, barely legible. June 11th, he threatened to reveal it all. "I've hidden the truth below. Let fire take the rest." "That was the night before he died," I said quietly. Holmes nodded. "So Danvers came here, attempted to burn the evidence, but lost his nerve, or perhaps realized the fire would be too visible. He left the rest hidden, hoping it would never be found." "And South?" I asked. "If he came afterward," Holmes said, "he would have seen the charred remains and assumed all was lost. That would buy us time." We left the crypt in silence, the air somehow colder, now that we understood what secrets lay beneath. Back in the chapel nave, Pitt locked the door behind us and turned with a heavy expression. "What now?" he asked. "Now," Holmes said, "we find Southcote." He glanced toward the stained glass window that filtered in one light. "He's not merely a blackmailer. No, Watson Southcote is the architect of this entire affair, and like all architects, he's left fingerprints in the mortar." Chapter 10. The Architect in Shadow. The next morning broke with a low mist crawling over the rooftops of St. Ives, clinging to chimneys and drifting like smoke across the slats. Holmes was already pacing the floor of our rooms at the inn when I awoke, a sheaf of notes in one hand, a small roll of architectural blueprints in the other. "I trust you slept, Watson," he said briskly, eyes sharp. I, alas, had no such luxury. My mind has been turning over the implications of our discovery. "The ledger?" I asked, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "And what it suggests about our elusive Mr. South." He tapped the rolled blueprint. "Do you recall when Reverend Pitt mentioned that the restoration work after the fire was done by a local firm? And Mr. Milford was named in the ledger, but Milford was not a licensed architect. Then who was?" "Southcote," Holmes said. "Edwards, once an architect of some promise in London, expelled from the Royal Institute over a scandal involving forged certifications and dangerous alterations to historical buildings. He vanished from professional circles nearly a decade ago, the same time the fire at St. Thaddeus occurred." "So he re-emerged in St. Ives?" I asked. "Precisely. Under the guise of consulting, using men like Milford as frontmen. It would allow him to work discreetly, shielded from regulation." Holmes paused, unrolling the blueprint across the breakfast table. "And here, Watson, lies the most interesting part." He pointed to a section marked as Crypt Retaining Wall, Reinforcement Plan. There were two versions of the plan, one properly aligned with the original structure, and the other slightly altered. A passage was discreetly added behind the eastern wall, one not listed in the final parish. "Record Southcote created a concealed compartment," Holmes said, "likely beneath the lectern where Danvers hid the ledger. But why? What required such secrecy?" My mind reeled. "A vault, smuggled items, perhaps relics." "Possibly," Holmes said, "but I believe it's tied to something far less holy. Recall the mention in the ledger. Per instruction of E.S., this was not merely a restoration. This was repurposing." I frowned. "Repurposing? Of a crypt, indeed." The fire provided an excuse to alter the structure without scrutiny. Southcote could build whatever he wished into the stonework while the chapel lay in ashes. He rolled up the blueprint with a snap. "I need to see the man. The question is, where does he hide?" We spent the afternoon combing through property records at the local magistrate's office. The clerk, a thin, balding man named Carver, was hesitant at first. But Holmes's charmant, a sovereign discreetly loosened his tongue. "Edward Southcote," he muttered, flipping through a dusty volume, "doesn't own much in his name. Ah, here we are. Leased a cottage on Harrow's Hill some 7 months ago. Calls himself Edgar Scott in the deed." Holmes grinned. "The initials remain." The cottage in question was a modest affair, stone-walled, roofed in thatch, and tucked behind a low hedge of hawthorn. It stood alone at the edge of the moor, wind-battered and silent. We approached at dusk, the sun sagging behind a bank of clouds and throwing long shadows over the lane. Holmes knocked, no answer. He knocked again, louder, still silence. Then, as he reached for the latch, I caught a flicker through the side window. A movement, quick, almost furtive. Holmes turned, eyes narrowing. "Someone's inside." He tried the door. Locked. "Back," he whispered. Around the garden, quietly, we crept around the cottage, where an overgrown hedge led to a small tool shed and rear porch. Holmes crouched beside the window and peered through a crack in the curtain. "Well," he said softly, "our architect is indeed within, and he's burning papers." I looked. A gaunt man, his hair streaked with gray, stood before a fireplace, feeding documents into a low flame. The light flickered over his hollow features, his brow beaded with sweat. A valise lay open on the table, half-packed, with more documents stuffed inside. Holmes didn't hesitate. He rapped sharply on the glass. The man flinched, then bolted for the door, but Holmes was already moving. He leaped around the corner just as Southcote yanked the door open, and they collided with force. Southcote staggered back, fell against the threshold, and Holmes pinned him easily with a knee to the chest. "Let go. You've no right," he snarled. Holmes merely smiled. "Good evening, Mr. Southcote. Or should I say Mr. Scott?" The alias was clever, though not clever enough to burn your past entirely. I secured the man's wrists, while Holmes kicked shut the door and swept the room for evidence. He recovered the valise, scooped a handful of half-burned papers from the grate, and turned them over with delicate fingers. "Schematics," he said, and ... "Ah, a letter. From Danvers." He read quickly, his face tightening with each line. Then he looked up. "This is no longer merely blackmail," Holmes said grimly. "This is a matter of murder." I froze. "You mean—" Danvers threatened to go to the police. He had repented, you see. He wrote to Southcote, "I cannot be your accomplice in this any longer. I will tell them what lies beneath the chapel." Southcote glared up at Holmes with hollow defiance. He had his chance to walk away. Holmes's voice was quiet. "You murdered him. Perhaps not with your own hands, but you drove him to that grave." The man said nothing. We escorted him under protest to the St. Ives constable, where Holmes handed over the documents and gave a terse account of the arrest. The fire in the man's eyes never dimmed, but the moment he crossed the threshold of that stone cell, some dark satisfaction in Holmes flickered out. "Watson," he said as we stepped back into the night air, "we now know who manipulated Danvers, who exploited the chapel, and why it all began. But what remains," I said, "is the final question." Holmes nodded solemnly. "What was hidden beneath the chapel that was worth killing for?" Chapter 11. Beneath the altar the next morning dawned bitterly cold. A wind had swept in from the coast, dragging salt and mist over the narrow lanes of St. Ives. Holmes was already tying his scarf when I entered the common room of the inn, his boots still dusted from his early walk. "We have delayed long enough, Watson," he said, glancing at the clock on the mantel. "Today, we descend into the crypt." "The sealed chamber," I said. "You believe Danvers hid something more than records." "Not hidden," Watson. "I suspect Danvers was not the villain we imagined, but a man caught in the web of Southcote's scheme. When his conscience awoke, he tried to make amends. His final note and that blueprint confirm it." As we left the inn and made our way through the chilled streets, the village seemed quieter than usual. News of Southcote's arrest had spread. Some locals whispered near doorways. Others avoided our gaze altogether. The chapel loomed at the end of the green, as grim and mute as ever. Inside, the cold was deeper, the stone walls radiating a damp unease. Reverend Pitt awaited us at the nave, his face pale and drawn. "I have the keys," he said quietly, holding out a heavy iron ring. "To the crypt. I haven't set foot down there since my first week here." The smell alone was unbearable. Holmes took them with a nod. "Thank you, Reverend. I assure you, we'll be quick." The trapdoor groaned as we lifted it. A square of blackness yawned beneath, steep stone steps vanishing into the gloom. I lit a lantern, the flickering light dancing across the cracked tiles. Holmes descended first, and I followed, the Reverend remaining above. The air was heavy with mildew and dust. Shelves of ancient ledgers and water-damaged prayer books lined one wall. Rusted candlesticks lay in a pile, half melted, but it was the eastern wall that drew our attention. The blueprint had been accurate. There was a faint seam in the stone, where the false panel had been mortared in place. Holmes ran a gloved hand along the edge, then tapped sharply. "Hollow," he said. "Watson, your lantern." With the help of a chisel he'd brought, Holmes pried at the edge. A chunk of stone gave way, then another, until the panel slid inward with a groan. Beyond was a narrow corridor, no more than 4 feet wide. The air inside was foul, and our lantern cast eerie shadows across brickwork that looked hastily laid. We pressed on, Holmes leading. The corridor turned sharply, then descended 4 steps into a vaulted chamber, no larger than a small study. At its center stood a crude stone table, and upon it, a chest. I whispered, a thick, iron-bound box, stained and scarred, with a broken lock dangling from one side. Holmes examined it carefully before lifting the lid. Inside were bundles wrapped in oilskin papers, aged parchment, scrolls, and something else, a velvet pouch. Its contents heavy and metallic. Holmes opened it. Dozens of Roman coins, glinting faintly in the lantern light, their edges worn but unmistakable. He turned one over. "3rd century," he murmured. "Watson, this chapel is older than anyone suspected. The Norman foundations were merely the latest layer in a site that has seen worship for over a millennium." "And Southcote knew," I said, staring. "He used the fire to excavate, not to restore but to plunder." Holmes nodded grimly. This hoard, hidden, forgotten, perhaps even sacred, would fetch a fortune in the black antiquities market. Southcote needed a man like Danvers to help him move the items discreetly. And when Danvers tried to stop him, he died. I finished. Holmes pulled out a scroll and examined the brittle script. Latin early, Church Latin, and fragments of Greek. These could be priceless theological documents. Will the authorities preserve them? With luck, Holmes said, closing the chest. Though I fear greed will circle like vultures once word spreads. We returned to the chapel in silence. Sealing the crypt as we had found it, Holmes handed the pouch of coins to Reverend Pitt, his voice soft. Guard these well. The rest must go to the British Museum. I will write to a trustworthy contact. The vicar stared at the pouch, then at us, as though only now beginning to grasp the weight of the chapel's secret. And as we stepped out into the winter sun, Holmes turned his face to the breeze and said, "Some sanctuaries are built on centuries of silence, Watson, but even stones whisper, if you know how to listen." Chapter 12. The Mark of the Dead. Back at the inn. The fire crackled warmly in the grate, but the chill from the crypt had seeped into our very bones. Holmes stood at the window, pipe unlit, fingers steepled beneath his chin, as he watched a group of villagers huddled near the chapel. "Green. They know something's afoot," I said, stirring the tea Mrs. Gulliver had brought up. "You've shaken the roots of this town." "Holmes, it was never my intention to bring chaos, Watson," he replied without turning. "Only clarity. But light has its price when cast over secrets long buried." He turned then, his eyes gleaming. "Tell me, what did you make of the stain on the stone table in the hidden chamber? It looked ... old. Like rust or dried sap." Holmes shook his head. "Blood, Watson. Dried over time, certainly, but unmistakable, and not from a centuries-old sacrifice. Either fresh enough that the scent still lingered beneath the musk of age." "You think Danvers was?" "I think he may have been killed down there, or at least wounded, perhaps during a confrontation." A knock interrupted our discussion. It was Inspector Moreau, looking considerably less dismissive than during our previous meetings. "We've completed the sweep of Southcote's residence," he said, closing the door behind him. "Found ledgers, lists of artifacts, even a coded correspondence we're working to decipher. But there's something else, something I thought you should see." He handed Holmes a small linen handkerchief, stained and neatly folded. Inside it was a brass ring bent at the band, the signet face smeared with a dark residue. Holmes took it, turning it in the light. "Where was this found?" "Wedged between the stones in the chapel vestry," said Mir. "Must have been missed during the initial search." Holmes frowned, then brought the signet close. "Watson, the crest you see. It's not Southcote's." I leaned forward. The mark was faint, a raised lion rampant over crossed keys, surrounded by a border of thorns. I did not recognize the emblem. "It's the Danvers family seal," Holmes said quietly. "From the Eastern Branch. I recall a similar pattern during the Willingford estate investigation years ago." Moreau looked puzzled. "So the ring is "No," Holmes replied. "His uncle's. Bishop Nathaniel Danvers, excommunicated in 1862 for heretical teachings. He was rumored to have taken sanctuary in remote parts of Cornwall in his final years, teaching obscure theology and writing treatises on death rituals." "Obscure theology?" I asked. "In that chapel," Holmes nodded. "I believe the crypt's hidden chamber may not have been just a hiding place. It could have been used by this renegade bishop. That might explain the ancient scrolls. And if Southcote discovered their origin, he might have seen himself as their heir." I finished grimly. "But that's not all," Moreau interrupted. "We found a second item in the chapel walls, a partial human jawbone, crushed recent." We all fell silent. Holmes's voice, when it came, was low and sharp. "Danvers never left the chapel, Watson. His remains are still there." A cold prickle ran down my spine. Holmes stood suddenly. "Inspector, I need access to the vestry again tonight." Quietly. "No officers, just lanterns and trowels. Bring 2 men you trust, and tell no one else, not even the magistrate you suspect Southcote buried Danvers within the chapel itself." Moreau asked. Holmes gave him a piercing look. "I suspect someone did, whether Southcote or another." Moreau nodded. "You'll have your access." Midnight. After the inspector departed, I turned to Holmes. "Do you think there's more to this than greed, Holmes? More than stolen relics and vanished caretakers?" He looked back at me, expression unreadable. "There is something unwholesome buried in that stone, Watson. Southcote may have merely been a vessel, but the force behind all this, the silence, the rot in the walls, the way this village has turned its eyes away for years, it hints at something deeper, something older than murder." He crossed to the mantel and picked up the ancient scroll we'd brought back earlier. Its text was cracked and faded, but the symbols were unmistakable: keys, thorns, blood drawn in a chalice. "Let us hope," he said, folding the parchment, "that we are not too late to understand it." Chapter 13. The Bones in the Wall. The wind off the moor was sharp and biting as we returned to St. Ethelbert's. Under the cover of night, the moon, pale and high, cast jagged shadows across the ruined churchyard. Only 3 lanterns burned between us, one held by Inspector Merrow, the other 2 by his most trusted constables, men of stern character, who did not flinch when Holmes insisted that we dig beneath the chapel's ancient stones. The vestry was darker than I remembered, the air thick and unmoving, as though it had not stirred since the last rites were spoken here, decades ago. Holmes knelt before the east wall, brushing away loose mortar with gloved fingers. His eyes scanned the base with almost reverent care. "There," he said suddenly, pointing to a cluster of lichen-covered stones low to the ground. "These were set recently. Note the color, and the cement is different modern mix." Merrow gave the nod, and the constables set to work with their picks and trowels. The scrape of iron against stone echoed through the chapel like the scratch of claws. After 15 minutes of labor, the first stone gave way with a hollow groan. The stench came almost immediately. "Sweet, unmistakably human. God above," murmured one of the constables. Staggering back, Holmes stepped forward, covering his mouth with a cloth. He peered into the cavity, shining his lantern within. I glimpsed only the edge of a pale, half-decayed femur, before Holmes turned sharply to Merrow. "You'll need to stop the digging. This is now a crime scene." Merrow nodded grimly. "Bodies recent enough to still have flesh. That means foul play." Holmes gently removed something from the wall, a strip of torn cloth, caught between the bricks. It was maroon velvet, embroidered with fine golden thread. I recognized the pattern instantly. "The cuff of Reverend Southcote's robe?" I asked. "No," Holmes said softly. "Danvers. This was Danvers's ceremonial robe. I saw it in his study when we first visited." "Which means," Merrow frowned, "that Southcote stripped him after killing him." Holmes didn't answer immediately. He seemed caught in thought, eyes darting from the bones to the wall, then to the lantern glow flickering over the stone floor. "Something is missing," he said at last. "Southcote may have buried the body, but if he killed Danvers here, why leave the ring in the vestry? Why not destroy the robe, too?" "You think someone else staged it?" I asked. "Or someone else discovered the body later?" Holmes replied, standing slowly. "Perhaps the killer was not Southcote at all. Perhaps he, too, stumbled into a secret he was not meant to find." The revelation hung in the air, like the lantern's wavering light just then. One of the constables let out a low whistle and reached into the hole. He withdrew a small metal box, scorched at the edges, as though it had been exposed to fire. "What is it?" Merrow asked. Holmes took it carefully. "A pyx, a vessel for holding sacramental wafers, but this one's been modified. See the latch? It's been reinforced." He pried it open with his knife. Inside lay a brittle scrap of parchment, wrapped tightly around a sliver of darkened wood, carved with the same sigil we had seen before. A lion rampant over crossed keys. Holmes examined the parchment. Though water-stained and torn, a single phrase was still legible. "He who awakens the voice beneath the stone shall wear the stain of the marked." "Biblical?" I asked. "Hardly," said Holmes. "It's ritual language, cultic, likely written by the bishop himself for his followers." Merrow crossed his arms. "You're telling me this wasn't just a squabble between a relic hunter and a reverend?" "No," Holmes replied. "It was a legacy passed down in secret, from Bishop Danvers to those who still venerated him in the shadows of this parish. Southcote may have tried to suppress it or perhaps harness it. Either way, it killed him." The wind howled through the broken stained glass, and for a moment, it sounded almost like a chant, low, mournful, and distant. Holmes turned to us, face drawn. "This chapel isn't done yielding its ghosts, but tonight, at least, one of them has a voice again." Chapter 14. The Keeper of the Pyx by Morning. The pyx and its cryptic contents were safely locked away in Inspector Merrow's evidence room. Holmes, however, had not slept. He stood by the window of our modest lodgings at the Green Man Inn, eyes fixed on the mist that rolled over the moor, like a tide of ancient whispers. I watched him from the bed, sipping lukewarm tea, reluctant to disturb his thoughts. "Holmes," I said gently, "what exactly do you believe that relic means?" He turned, the early light casting sharp angles across his face. "It is not the pyx itself, Watson, but the ritual, the secrecy, the voice beneath the stone. That is the crux. We are not dealing with a mere relic theft or local hysteria. This is a network of silence, cultivated and protected, a priesthood behind the priesthood." Before I could ask more, there was a sharp knock at the door. Merrow entered, hat in hand, his expression a storm cloud of urgency. "We've found something else," he said. "In the rectory attic, a hidden compartment behind the chimney flue." Within the hour, we were back at St. Ethelbert's. The attic smelled of charred dust and disuse. A constable stood beside an open wooden panel, his gloves streaked with soot. Inside was a bundle of aged documents, bound with twine and sealed in wax, bearing the same Lion and Key sigil. Holmes unfolded the topmost with delicate care. "A journal," he murmured. "Bishop Danvers's hand, no doubt." He skimmed a few lines, his eyes narrowing. "Watson, listen to this. The marked shall remain buried until the turning moon. When the veil thins, then shall the voice call once more from beneath the altar. Only the keeper may answer. Only the keeper may silence it." Holmes merely nodded. The chapel loomed ahead like a slumbering creature, each buttress a hunched shoulder, each stained glass window a dead eye. The front doors creaked open under Holmes's push. Dust and candle soot danced in the moonlight. "We'll go behind the altar," Holmes said. "Keep your lanterns low." At the base of the altar, partially hidden beneath a tattered red cloth, lay a wooden trapdoor. Merrow produced a crowbar. With a grunt, he lifted the hatch, revealing a narrow passage plunging into utter blackness. The descent was tight and steep. The air fetid with rot and damp stone. Walls wept moisture, and the faint scent of burning herbs clung to the stale air. Holmes went first, stepping into the gloom, as though returning to a familiar haunt. Watson followed with the lantern, casting flickering shadows that slithered across the rough-hewn walls. The tunnel opened into a cavernous underground chamber, older than the chapel above. Moss-covered stones formed a circular wall, broken only by alcoves carved with grotesque figures. Faceless men, bleeding suns, open mouths dot in the center stood a stone dais, and on it, bound in cloth and rope, lay the body of Reverend Danvers. Merrow swore. Watson moved swiftly to check for a pulse, but Holmes caught his shoulder. "Wait." He stepped forward and knelt by the altar. With precise fingers, he peeled back the cloth over Danvers's face. The vicar's eyes were shut, his skin pale but unmarked. "Not a corpse yet. He's drugged," Holmes murmured. But look here." He lifted Danvers's sleeve, revealing a burned sigil, a spiral etched in blistered skin. Watson recoiled. "Good Lord, what would possess a man to brand himself?" "A vow," Holmes replied, "or a curse." The shadows stirred. At the far end of the chamber, a cloaked figure emerged from the wall itself, Laybourne, no longer disheveled or raving. He walked with solemn purpose, his voice echoing unnaturally in the hollow space. "You shouldn't have come." Holmes rose. "On the contrary, we're exactly where we need to be." "You've interrupted the final ceremony," Laybourne intoned. "The voice will not be silenced. You cannot stop it. It is older than this church, older than the stones. It speaks through the willing." Holmes tilted his head. "Willing or vulnerable? You drugged the children, didn't you? Laced their rosaries, filled their lungs with incense, all to make them conduits for your madness." Laybourne's eyes flashed. "They are purified, cleansed of doubt. That's more than you can say suddenly." He raised his hand from the alcoves. Two more figures emerged, acolytes in black hoods, each holding ceremonial blades. Merrow drew his revolver. Watson readied a sedative. But Holmes didn't flinch. "You've mistaken devotion for domination, Laybourne," he said calmly. "You think this chamber gives you power, but it only mirrors the mind of the man who walks it." He stepped forward, voice rising. "This isn't the voice of the divine, it's the voice of you, amplified by stone and ritual and fear. But even you know it must end. Why else drug the vicar? Why else burn the truth into your own flesh?" For the first time, Laybourne faltered. Behind them, Danvers stirred. A cough, then a groan. Holmes was beside him in an instant, cutting the ropes, whispering quietly. "Reverend," he said, "it's time to reclaim your church." Danvers blinked, his voice hoarse. "What have I done?" Holmes helped him sit upright. "There's still time to make it right." From behind, a click. Merrow had drawn his revolver fully. The acolytes froze. "Laybourne," Holmes said, turning back, "you've lost your altar. Surrender." Laybourne trembled. The voice is never silenced. Then he dropped the blade and fell to his knees. Chapter 18. The truth at 1:45. The hour was late, and the lamp in our sitting room burned with a weary glow. Holmes stood with his back to the fire, the greystone letter laid upon the table between us. His expression was grim, no trace of his usual cool irony or aloof precision. Something about this case had touched him in a way few others had. "We must return to Greystone House," he said abruptly. "Tonight." I glanced at the rain-blurred window. "In this weather, in this hour," he corrected. "Whatever walks our landing at night will do so again. But its origin is not here, Watson. It must begin where the letter was meant to arrive." We reached Greystone just before 1:30. The building loomed silent and damp, its broken windows shuttered with newspaper and rot. Holmes led me through the rear passageway we had used once before, and with lantern in hand, descended into the musty cellar beneath the conservatory. "Help me with this," he whispered. A cracked tile in the far corner was pried free, revealing a hollow beneath. From it, Holmes withdrew a rusted biscuit tin, carefully wrapped in oilskin. Inside was a journal, leather-bound, stained by time and something darker. He flipped through it rapidly, page after page of scattered thoughts, jumbled dates, crude sketches of a cloaked figure with a missing face. Then, finally, near the end, I walk now in two places, one with breath, one with shame. He wears my shape, but he is hollow. I gave him the wound. I wore the wound. Now, he wears me. I swallowed. Who wrote this? Holmes tapped the final page, where a name was scrawled in a broken, trembling hand. George Mallon. The missing man from Greystone's ledger. The one assumed drowned. The one who'd vanished 6 years before without a trace. But that's impossible, I said. He's presumed dead. Holmes straightened. Precisely. We returned to Baker Street well past 2. The hallway was silent. No footsteps. No damp prints. No trace of the visitor who had haunted our nights. But inside, atop Holmes's desk, lay a card. Blank. Except for the mark of a red wound. Painted in blood. It was the following morning, grey and quiet, when Holmes summoned Inspector Lestrade to our rooms. "There was never a man named Silas Vent," Holmes said as Lestrade looked incredulously over the journal. "No, Silas Vent," the inspector repeated. "But he owned Greystone. He forged the deeds, stole Mallon's identity after his disappearance. The real Mallon was unstable, clearly suffering some mental collapse, worsened by isolation. It appears he developed an alternate persona, fractured self, whom he referred to as the Hollow One. When Mallon vanished, Vent stepped in, but not from nowhere." Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "You think they were the same person?" Holmes shook his head. "I think Silas Vent killed George Mallon." Watson spoke softly. "Then, why the pacing? The footsteps?" "Because guilt," Holmes murmured, "is the most precise of timekeepers." He pointed to the journal. "Every night at 1:30, Mallon would walk the halls of Greystone. It was his ritual, a means of keeping his mind anchored. After his death, the man who took his place couldn't shake the habit. He wore the role so long it became him. Even after moving into new quarters under a new name, the footsteps remained. A reenactment, a confession in motion." Lestrade stared. "And the letter?" Holmes picked it up. "Written by Mallon, addressed to his solicitor, but never sent. He must have hidden it before his end. Vent, after killing him, discovered it later, and burned most of it, but not before it left a trace. Enough to haunt him. And the appearance at your flat? I suspect he followed the letter here. Whether by guilt or fear, he began his nightly pacing outside our door, perhaps believing Mallon's spirit had found new guardians." Lestrade closed the journal. "So, where is Vent now?" Holmes's expression darkened. "Gone, likely fled the moment he realized the game was ending. But he won't go far," Holmes said coldly. "A man who carries a ghost inside him has few places to hide." That evening, Holmes stood alone in our parlor, gazing into the fire. I sat quietly, nursing a scotch and contemplating the eerie symmetry of it all. "You've solved hundreds of cases, Holmes," I said finally, "but this one felt different." He nodded once. "Because it was." "Do you believe he really wore another man's soul?" Holmes smiled faintly. "No, Watson, but I believe in the wounds men carry, and how sometimes they bleed through the seams of even the most convincing masks." He raised his glass. "To the man who wore a wound," I followed suit, "and to the one who uncovered it." We drank in silence, the footsteps forever stilled.